The election results are in, and Donald Trump and JD Vance will be the 47th President and Vice President of the United States after securing a win in a narrow race with Vice President and Democratic candidate Kamala Harris on Tuesday night. From Pennsylvania to Wisconsin to Georgia, tensions and turnout appeared high as the ballot boxes opened for an historic election after a fatiguing campaign trail. It's an election only Americans participate in, but whose results the rest of the world must contend with, particularly as wars continue in the Middle East. With Arab American voters at an unlikely center of this election cycle, questions linger about politics, policy, and the potential for change, both at home and in the Middle East. Welcome to the Year of Elections, a podcast series brought to you by the Opinion Desk at The National. I'm your host, Sulaiman Hakimi, and for our final episode on this U.S. race, we're on video in our studio in Abu Dhabi with Paul Salem, who's the Vice President for International Engagement at the Middle East Institute, and Mina Al-Oraibi, our Editor-in-Chief here at The National. Welcome. Paul, the first question is to you. So this was a much faster election result than many people anticipated, despite it being a very contentious race. So just give us your thoughts. Was this a surprise to you at all? I mean, how do you feel about this result?
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. First of all, I think it's a surprise in the sense that all elections should be a surprise. At the end of the day, it's the people who decide what happens. And I'm satisfied that it was a regular election. People expressed themselves, and we got the result that we did. Elections are not what polls say they are, and they have to be run through the normal process. So I'm satisfied that the U.S. election system held, that the U.S. democratic process is holding, that there will be a peaceful transfer of power. The result itself was not a major surprise. Obviously, going back to the polls, they predicted that this is too close to call. A coin toss, as they said, that either side could have won. He did do better than he did in 2016, apparently, so that maybe is a little bit of a surprise. On the other hand, if you pull back and look at the political landscape, this was a very unpopular administration. The president's approval rating has hovered in the 30% range for most of the administration. It is an administration which started in the midst of a historic pandemic, which people really did not enjoy, and why should they enjoy a pandemic? And then it was followed by a couple of years of very high inflation. So it's not a surprise that the incumbent party lost. It is expected, and incumbent parties have been losing elections in many other places. The incumbent party, when Trump was president, lost in 2020. It's also the case that if the Republican Party had a different candidate than Donald Trump, they probably would have done considerably better than Donald Trump did. Donald Trump is the Republican candidate, but he also faced a lot of headwinds because of his January 6 attempts to undo the elections in 2020 and his general behavior, which really alienated many Republicans and made the campaign for Republicans harder than it should have been. But nevertheless, he and the Republican Party have taken the White House and the Senate and might also take the House.
So, Mina, it sounds what I'm inferring from what Paul said is that it's less of a vote of confidence for Donald Trump and more of a vote in the opposite direction against the Democratic Party, Kamala Harris, and the presidency of Joe Biden. But would you agree with that? I mean, the National's done some polling on U.S. sentiment. What's your take?
Definitely a vote against the current administration. And of course, with Vice President Kamala Harris being the candidate, it would have been seen in some ways a continuity of the current administration, even though key figures, of course, would have been out of it. But I do think this was a vote for Trump, and he now is fully representative of the Republican Party. In 2016 and 2020, we had different conversations, but now it seems very much he represents the Republican Party, and they rallied around him, and he has a mandate. If the vote was closer, perhaps you could have that conversation and say, well, actually, it was to a great extent a rejection of a continuation of the current administration, but it really was a sense of we want to go in a different direction and we accept the direction that Trump will take us because it seems to be such a decisive vote. And the fact that the Senate is also going to the Republicans and most likely the House, it's a clean sweep for Donald Trump. And it's quite interesting because in some of the contested seats, these were candidates that Trump endorsed, and they did very well. And so I think he can claim a mandate and decisive victory, and we'll see what he does with it.
Now, this election was interesting, Mina, because we had a sudden change of candidate just weeks from voting day. And that was maybe Kamala Harris's opportunity to really break from the reputation of the Biden administration, both at home and abroad. But do you think it's that she simply failed to achieve that?
She didn't break. That was the point. And in the interviews with Kamala Harris, with people that you spoke around the campaign, there was no sense of publicly wanting to distance themselves from the administration. And so she had the opportunity, she didn't take it. And I think there was too much of complacency, to be frank, that when it was decided that Biden wouldn't run for president, and there was that change in candidacy, she absolutely got an initial surge because people were relieved that it wasn't going to be Biden running as the Democratic candidate, and they kind of rested on that. But actually that surge didn't last very long, and very quickly it was hard to define who Kamala Harris actually was, certainly when it came to foreign policy. She waited until the very last night of campaigning to say that she would work to end the war in Gaza. Now, she could have said that from the very beginning and perhaps spoken with a different tone when it came to Arab American voters, Muslim American voters, and a number of other issues. It really wasn't clear when it came to divisive issues, to the exception perhaps of abortion and reproductive rights. We did polling at the National, as you rightly said, just 10 days ago. 10 days before the election, we unveiled some of this polling. 51% of voters said the number one issue is the cost of living. And that was not properly addressed. And whoever came up with the term Bidenomics and thought that would help the Democrats win the election really didn't have a proper sense of what voters were thinking.
Paul, I just want to pick up on something Mina said, which is about Arab Americans. Now, this is the first time that I can remember, and maybe the first time in history, that a presidential candidate or president-elect in his victory speech singled out Arab American voters and Muslim American voters for their help in getting him elected. So tell us a little bit about that relationship between Donald Trump and this perhaps unlikely constituency of supporters?
Well, it's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to it. Have previous presidents, different points in the campaign or after winning, thanked or not? I remember George W. Bush was very vocal about, especially after 9/11, going to mosques and going to centers to reinforce the relationship between the administration or the U.S. government in general and the Muslim American community. So that's an interesting research question as to, is this new or not? It's very much the case, obviously, that Michigan is and was a swing state. It looks like he won it, and a lot of that hinged on the Arab American vote. There are Arab Americans in his campaign. There are Arab Americans now in his family, Lebanese Americans in his family. Dearborn, Michigan, obviously, is a big Lebanese sort of Arab American town. And it became a pivot issue in Michigan. Which was something that, as Mina was saying, that candidate Kamala Harris did not handle very adroitly and maybe lost votes there. And we saw the result of that early on in the campaign. The Biden administration was very concerned for months now about that. And it is perhaps the first time in my memory following U.S. elections where an Arab American vote really seemed to potentially make a lot of difference. Now, in retrospect, given the result of the election, given the margin with which Donald Trump won, maybe it would not have made that much of a difference. But there was expectations that it was going to be much closer. Michigan could have swung the election one way or another. So it really received a lot of attention in the campaign. It is important that Donald Trump is addressing, now that he knows he's going to be president, is addressing the Arab American, the Muslim American, Lebanese American, Palestinian American, and bringing that, keeping that in the consciousness of his campaign, his presidency that he's putting together. And as we shift a bit to foreign policy, I think the most significant thing that President Trump has been saying about the wars in the Middle East, putting aside the wars in Europe, that when he assumes power on January 20, he wants no wars to be ongoing. And I think that is a signal that is very strongly heard in Israel and by Prime Minister Netanyahu. And Trump has also said that he supports what Israel is doing. He supports whatever Israel is doing. He has no real position on the issues, but he wants it to be over and he wants it to be settled by the time he comes to office. And that could translate into some results in Gaza, some results in Lebanon. We are yet to see what the escalation between Israel and Iran might bring between now and December, January.
So I want to get into the meat of foreign policy in just a second, but really quickly, I just want to dig into one aspect of this relationship between Trump and Arab American voters. I mean, Trump invited the mayor of Hamtramck, Michigan, up on stage, a man who has said that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, who's done a boycott in his municipality of Israel. Some commentators have suggested that there's a kind of double standard in Trump's ability to court these voters versus Kamala Harris, because had Kamala Harris done that, you might have seen a huge amount of criticism from pro-Israel groups in the US saying, you know, what is she doing? She's betraying Israel and so on. Trump got virtually none of that blowback. I mean, why do you think that is, Mina?
Partly because Trump is very direct. And so he says, I can cut deals with different people and I can shift when necessary to bring about an effective change. And I think that's the point that Paul is making, is that when he says, I want there not to be any wars, it's not he's going to put out, you know, a 10-point program of how that happens. It's just get it done. Now, some people will say that's very messy and that's not how you should conduct world affairs. Others will say we have too much of managing crises, of, you know, having a Secretary of State visit the region 15 times to no end without actually bringing a result, which is what happened with Secretary of State Antony Blinken. So he doesn't get the same pushback, I believe, because partly he's saying, I will do whatever it takes. And yes, I can call this person up on stage and I can make a phone call with that person, but I want to see effective change. And the problem with Kamala Harris is you wouldn't know what she ultimately wanted to do. Trump has been very clear. He is fully supportive of Israel. He makes no qualm about that. However, he's also been very clear that we can't continue business as usual. There has to be change. And in our polling, it was very clear that Democrats and Republicans, or Democratic supporters and Republican supporters, felt that Trump would bring a swift end to the conflict without necessarily saying if that was good or bad, but a swift end. So I think he's built up this reputation of getting deals done.
Let me add something. I mean, on the personality issue, Bibi Netanyahu has been able to push Joe Biden around and humiliate him. He was able to do that with Barack Obama to some degree as well. He certainly was doing it with Kamala Harris. He can't do that with Donald Trump. Donald Trump is much bigger of a bully than Bibi Netanyahu. He's much more of an alpha male. And he doesn't tolerate, as a person, as a personality. And I think Netanyahu knows that. And he can't play the same game that he plays in Congress, upstaging Joe Biden, humiliating Joe Biden, which he did with Barack Obama when Obama negotiated the deal. Because Trump doesn't put up with that, and Trump doesn't behave as if he's beholden to anybody. In his campaign, when he was unhappy with the Jewish American votes, he threatened them. And he said things that if Kamala Harris had said about Jews or Israel, they would have been, you know, she would have been really attacked. So he is a very unpredictable and very strong-willed, very unpredictable person, doesn't think things through necessarily, but that's who he is. And that's something that will impact the relationship between Israel, or between Netanyahu and Donald Trump. They're different personalities. And even though he's completely supportive of the right wing in Israel, not just Israel in general, but Joe Biden is supportive of Israel, but not so much of the right wing, the relationship, Donald Trump would want to be the dominant player in that relationship.
Now, I mean, one of the downsides of being strong-willed is that Mr. Trump may not have that much patience for alternative viewpoints. And you know, Benjamin Netanyahu, I don't think there's been a prime minister in a very long time in Israel who's been so opposed to a two-state solution or any other out-of-the-box ideas to find peace between Palestine and Israel. Do you think it's likely that Donald Trump will take seriously any kind of realistic or innovative proposals for peace in Palestine? I mean, we saw his deal of the century in his last administration, which I don't think many people would say was in Palestine's favor. But could we see a shift in solutions now?
Well, first of all, I don't think he considers these issues priorities for the U.S. He's Make America Great Again. He's America First. And I once asked his national security advisor, what are Trump's priorities for Iran? And it was an interesting question. He said, there's only three things that Trump wants from Iran: that it doesn't have a nuclear weapon, that its missiles don't reach the U.S. homeland, not relating to Israel or the Gulf, and that its militias don't attack Americans. That's it. So no, I don't think Trump will wake up in the morning and say, well, what's my plan for the Middle East and so on. What he does have a concern for is relations with the Gulf. And given that this deal that he certainly and any Democratic administration would have tried to pursue, a U.S. Saudi-Israeli deal, he wants that very, very strongly, as do many Democrats, as do many in the Gulf, many in Israel as well. But because now that hinges on progress on the Palestinian issue, he or Jared Kushner or Mike Pompeo, whoever it is who's going to be prioritizing this deal with Saudi Arabia, which will be prioritized because it relates to keeping China away and relates to global interests of the United States, they will have to figure out how to deal with the Palestinian issue to get something else, which is this deal with the Gulf in general, to solidify the U.S.-Gulf relationship and bring Israel into it. And to the degree, and this is where the leverage that Saudi Arabia and the Gulf has, working with Israelis and Palestinians to put something on the table that Trump can support or that's realistic and that can be achieved, and that it not just be an obstacle without any realistic solution.
Now, of course, Mina, one element of that equation of let's call it a grand bargain in the Middle East, would be what Iran wants and does, in reaction to all of this. The last Trump presidency was not on great terms with the Iranian government. They pulled out of the agreement that Obama had secured with Iran. Now, the FBI has alleged that Iran tried to assassinate Mr. Trump during his campaign. Do you think there is a path to a peace deal with Iran? I mean, Iran has a new government now under Pezeshkian. So do you think there's room for any momentum there?
There are many variables that will determine the answer to how Iran will react to the Trump presidency, but also how a new Trump presidency will behave when it comes to Iran. And four of those variables are: first, how much will Donald Trump take the issue of the attempt to assassinate him being alleged to be driven by Iran, how seriously he takes that and how personally he takes it. I think that will be an important element. Two, who will lead foreign policy for Donald Trump? Will it be Jared Kushner? Will it be Mike Pompeo? Will it be somebody like Joel Rayburn? We don't know yet. And they will help chart some of this. Three, the variable that we must keep in mind is how Iran currently feels at the moment, given all the blows it's taken, predominantly when it comes to Hezbollah, when it comes to Hamas. Iran is greatly weakened compared to where it was 4 years ago or 8 years ago. So how they then behave. And I'd say the fourth variable, which is going to be important, is how Israelis and the Iranians together think of the next phase. Is it going to be, let's escalate further, because if the Israelis feel emboldened with the Trump presidency, or if the Iranians feel that they must now really go all out to try to regain some of the so-called deterrence or regain some of the footing that they've lost. So the next few weeks will be hugely important. And of course, to keep in mind that inauguration isn't until the end of January. A lot can happen from now until the end of January, as either Iran tries to be in a stronger negotiating position before the next administration comes in, or Israel feels, okay, I've got to clear up as much as possible, as Paul was saying, if they feel that they're under, some sort of pressure to create dynamics on the ground that then Trump inherits and takes forward.
So, Paul, I'll put the last question to you then. As Mina said, a lot depends on what happens between now and January. What do you think the outgoing Biden administration can do realistically in the next couple of months to pave the path for a successful Trump presidency, in the Middle East or at home or on the world stage?
I think the Biden administration has very little agency in this situation. Much depends on what Prime Minister Netanyahu does and how the Supreme Leader Khamenei reacts in the next few weeks. I do think Israel will escalate on Iran. I think Iran will be responding to Israel, maybe through Iraq. But I think that dynamic still has not fully played out. So what Trump will inherit will be a situation which will have unfolded over the next few weeks vis-a-vis the big issue, which is Israel-Iran. Now, on some of the lesser files, I think there is a possibility of de-escalation between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. I think the Israelis are open to that. And that's where Biden administration diplomacy with Amos Hochstein could bear some results, because I think Israel is potentially interested. It's not a huge, they've already achieved most of the gains that they want. I doubt there can be similar progress on the Gaza front because of the complications there. So I think there's not much that the Biden administration can do. And let me end pulling back and looking at Trump when he takes over. Trump is not a hawk. He's not a traditional Republican hawk. Trump does not look at Iran as a permanent foe of the United States. Candidate Trump, even in this last campaign, he said, "Why do I have sanctions on Russia? Why do I have sanctions on Iran? I want to make a deal with Iran. The U.S. and Iran can be very good friends." Pezeshkian said the same thing. So unlike Mike Pompeo and a few others, John Bolton previously in the previous administration, Trump is not wedded to a hardline position to Iran, but Iran is. And they still haven't forgiven his killing of Soleimani, and now they're trying to assassinate him. So the brief version, if Iran is interested in a deal with Trump, Trump is very interested in a deal with Iran.
I want to build up on the point of the Gulf and how the Gulf kind of takes this moment, because I think some of the thinking in the Trump administration, but also for Iran and Israel, is thinking about the dynamics with the Gulf. And it's been really interesting to get a sense, at least from officials I've spoken to in the UAE and in other Gulf countries, is that with the Trump administration, and that there is a decisive win, there's relief that this isn't going to drag out and the U.S. just gets caught up in lawsuits about who's actually the next president and all of that. So there's relief that this was decisive. There's also a sense that, Trump can actually change things in a way that it was unlikely that Harris would be able to. But also that they want to see an end of war. And there's also recognition that Palestine now is not to be put to the side, that there needs to be a more comprehensive solution. And that could influence some of the thinking with Donald Trump this time around, different from the previous presidency. So I think that the Gulf is in a comfortable position when it comes to the new administration, and they will also try to be de-escalatory and try to get out of this very tense moment to have a more stable, hopefully, initial period of the Trump presidency. And of course, the big question is what happens in Ukraine? Because Russia is a key player here when it comes to not only its relationship with Iran and what it means with Iran, but also Syria, the future of Syria. We're focused very much on Lebanon and Palestine, but Syria is part of this equation where, let's not forget, much of the Arab world wanted to find a way to welcome back the Bashar al-Assad regime into the fold, but they were disappointed that, again, Bashar al-Assad did not really adhere to some of the promises he made. Russia and Iran and the dynamic between them inside of Syria, hugely important. So I think there is an opportunity where some of these wars get resolved, but also new dynamics and new alliances get built.
Yeah, let me also mention one thing about, the Gulf perspective. Obviously, the Gulf is a big economic powerhouse, and they're big investors in the United States. They're big beneficiaries of globalization and global trade. Any U.S. president has a huge impact on, obviously, the U.S. economy and global trade and so on. And yes, I agree with Mina that they're relieved that at least they know who's in charge, and they know they've dealt with President Trump and his administrations before. He is pretty transactional, pretty straightforward, easy to deal with in that sense. But it's still not clear what the main elements and effects of his economic policy will be. One, on the U.S. economy itself, and there's huge Gulf investments inside the U.S. economy. So there's question marks there about how will tariffs affect inflation and growth in the U.S., how will border policy affect labor policy and then inflation and labor costs in the U.S., and there's concerns about the tariff proposals that President Trump has been talking about, how they affect global trade and relations between China and the U.S. and the global economy, which the Gulf is a huge beneficiary of. Also the fact that Trump and his team as now the Biden, as the Democratic Party, very much China hawks. And to what degree will that, put pressure on Gulf countries and so on? So just to say that the Gulf obviously is a Middle East region and cares about Middle East conflicts very much, and I think Mina covered those very well. But they're also global economic players, where economics, is a priority for them, as it is for Trump and as it is for U.S. voters.
Well, that was very insightful. Thanks very much, Paul Salem and Mina Al-Arabi. And that's it from us here at the Year of Elections. If you enjoyed this podcast, please find us on your favorite podcast app and hit subscribe.